I felt absolutely shunned and had no place in that church. And I had two choices. I could walk away from it totally, or I could stand back, take a deep breath, and walk back in.
Hey everyone, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chakowski. I'm the Director of Worship for Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is our lead pastor, Julie Richter.
Hey, what's going on, Eric?
Not much. Do you realize that this is our 12th episode already?
Is it really?
We're 12 in.
Wow, time has really flown.
It's when you're having fun.
That's right.
You know what they say.
Yeah, that's right. No, this has been a lot of fun. So as part of this podcast, we ask a question at the end of every week. And that question is, up until this point in your life, what is the one thing you wish someone would have told you? And in light of that question, we've started a new sermon series this last week.
So many of you may remember back to one of our first episodes, we had Dr. Stan Copeland on. And when we asked him that question, he paused and looked at us and said, church isn't easy. And so our first week of this series, this past Sunday, Julie preached on that very topic.
Well, and I think that's something that we can all resonate with, that whether we have been in the church for a really long time or we have only been in the church for a short amount of time, or even if the church is a place that we avoid, it is probably because church is not easy, and we all have experienced that in some way.
And so this week, as we were thinking through potential guests to interview, the first person that came to our mind was Gloria Scott. Gloria is the Director of Communication and Worship here at First Methodist Richardson. She's been on staff for many, many years and has seen a lot and experienced a lot. And we're really excited to have some conversation with her about the times in her life that church has not been easy.
Well, we are here today with Gloria Scott. Gloria is the Director of Worship and Communications here at First United Methodist Church, Richardson, which means that she does a lot at our church.
She basically runs the place.
That's right. So, Gloria, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, I love being here.
Yeah,
and with two of my favorite people.
That makes me
two
feel good.
Two of my favorite people that keep me young.
My day has been made. That's great.
So I know some of your background, Gloria, but why don't you tell for our listeners how long you've been here at First Richardson as a member and on staff?
Well, we moved to Richardson in 1973. We moved in August, and by October we were members of First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And I want to say that wasn't our choice. My husband and I thought, this is too big a church for us.
Oh.
And it was our children that found their place. And when the first day you were here, they hop in the car and say, we want to come back tonight. They invited us to come back tonight.
Oh, were they in youth at the time?
And yes, our older children were in youth. And wow, that was the beginning
That makes the
of
decision
a
for a lot of
wonderful,
families, yeah.
yes. And it was a wonderful journey that started at that time. We were active as Sunday school teachers, and I was chairman of the Council on Ministries at that time. Went on to be the administrative board chairman and the chairman of the board of trustees. And through a change of pastors, one came on and said, I need a former military wife to run the weddings. You don't have anybody running weddings at this church. And so I was contacted, and I was that person that was a former military wife and asked to be the wedding director. And I thought, how fun.
Yeah, interesting that was his requirement, though. Any idea why that requirement was put forward?
I don't know if we know the rules and regulations.
Or just keep people on time.
Proper.
That's right.
Wow.
And we know how to take orders and everything.
Yeah.
So that's where it all began. And that was my first job here at First Methodist, and did that for about 10 years or so, and I was asked to develop a communication department because we were known in the conference and in the city as the best kept secret in Dallas for many years. So it has been fun to birth that area of our church and tell our story. And then in 2002, I became director of worship also.
Wow, been here a long time.
Yeah. So we just started a sermon series called Things You Should Know. This week, Julie preached on the fact that church is hard sometimes. And the perception, I think, in the world very often is that church should be perfect. That because these are all people following Christ, that things should just work out, things should fall in line. But we know that is not the case. We know that isn't true. I wondered if you'd be willing to share either the first time or maybe a defining moment that you realized that church was not easy.
Well, my immediate response to that, Eric, is to say, I'm a mother of 6 children.
Nothing is
Church
easy.
was not easy. I immediately think about Sundays. There were times that it was frantic to get those bows tied and to get them dressed, and to think that we would be anywhere on time was almost impossible. So in that sense, church is not easy. We need to think about families when we think about church. But the defining moment, and being more serious about this, for me, came early in our marriage when my husband was in the military and went to Vietnam. And 4 of our children were with us at that time. And we moved back to the area where my parents lived, and it was a smaller town in the Midwest. Being a military family, we jumped in and were immediately involved in the community because you aren't there for a long time when you're in the military, and so you get acquainted, jump in, take responsibilities right away. So that was not foreign to me to be moving to a new place with the kids. And my parents lived in this town. It was a great chance for them to be with my parents and for me to feel their support. And I was very naive, not knowing that people didn't understand the military in this situation and with the time in society and where we were in our world and what we were doing politically. And I received that telegram that every spouse of a military person fears receiving. The telegram that said my husband was injured very seriously, that he was being air evac to Japan. And at that point, that was all I knew. For 3 months, he was in the hospital in Japan and air evac'd at the end of those 3 months to a hospital in the United States. He returned home 5 months later, a total of 5 months. But during that time, I had jumped in, was in PTA and Scouts and certainly the church and different organizations in town. And not one time did a pastor or anyone come to our home, talk to us about what was going on in our lives. And I realized sitting in church on a Sunday morning when a sermon was so politically oriented and was so down on the military, which was what my life was, I felt absolutely shunned and had no place in that church. So that was a defining moment for me. And I had 2 choices. I could walk away from it totally, or I could stand back, take a deep breath, and walk back in. And something helped me to walk back in and make that a priority in my life, which it had been always before. But as an adult And when Gilla was ready to come home and could come home, we made that commitment to our family that it would always be a heart of who we were, and we would not be defined by who other people assumed that we were.
That's so true. We do that in the church, and we do that in all of our relationships. We make assumptions about the struggles that people go through, or have a sense of ignorance to the struggles that people go through. And we have sort of sometimes a lack of responsiveness to that in the church, especially on a relational level. But the word that keeps coming back to me is grace. That the choice to walk back in was a choice of grace towards the church. And what a gift it is to us to get to see that grace in action. Because we talk about grace a lot in the church, and we talk about giving grace to one another, but we don't often say, you're going to have to find ways to give grace to your church too, because we're going to get it wrong sometimes too. And I think that that's a powerful message for us to be able to not only pray for one another, but pray for our churches and pray for our church leaders, because we're going to get it wrong too. My dad's a Methodist minister, and there was a time when I was struggling with a situation in the church, and he just stopped me and said, Julie, this is a human process with human people. And so it's not going to always happen in the way that we expect it to. So that word grace, I think, is huge, because church is not easy.
Yeah.
Church is not easy.
So, Gloria, one of the main ways that we see church is in the hour that we worship on Sunday mornings. Mm-hmm. And so when I started ministry, I started in children's ministry. And so I had this idea that I would come up with a lesson, and we would be on time, and they would learn so much. And then the children would come in the classroom, and hardly anything would go as expected. And so I learned,
the nature of children,
right? Yeah. So I learned pretty early on that things don't always go the way that we hope or expect them to go. And I'm sure that you have had that experience in worship. Can you share a story or two with us when things haven't gone the way you thought they would?
You know, there's many that come to my mind, many that I'm not going to share because somehow these things get covered over, and only the planner knows how wrong and how the direction changed.
That's so true.
You're talking our language.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm going to tell you one brief story, because we want everything to be meaningful and to be quality. And we strive for that here at FUMCR. I said earlier that I started with weddings and was a wedding director. I had no office here. I met outside the chapel, and there were some couches there, and that's where I sat and met with couples. I had just finished meeting with a couple, and I was putting everything away, and the pastor came out of the chapel and said, Gloria, can you play the piano?
Oh, my gosh.
And I laughingly said, oh, for my own enjoyment. And he said, oh, no, I need you to play for somebody else's enjoyment. And I said, oh, no. I don't play the piano.
Oh, my gosh.
And he said, what do you play? And I, again, laughingly, I had no idea what was going on in the chapel. And I said, Kumbaya. I'm an expert. And he says, come and play it. And I was like, what's going on? Well, our quality worship that was going on was a funeral for a very small, intimate family group in the chapel. And he said, it'll be perfect. So I went in and sat at a grand piano in the chapel and started playing Kumbaya. I would pause when I would finish one verse, and I kept thinking he would stand up, and he didn't stand up. And so I'd start again, and I played another verse. After the fifth time, I just took my hands off of the keys and sat there, and he got up, and we had this service, and I was going to leave, and I heard the words, and at the end of the service, we'll sing How Great Thou Art.
Oh, my gosh.
And it was his way of telling me that we were going to go on.
It's funny how sometimes speakers in services give direction to the congregation, but it's also, this is a trick I've used before. Direct the congregation so that you inform your team what will be happening.
What's happening?
I was frantically looking at the pages in the hymnal thinking, I don't know if I can even play these chords. So at the end of the service, I slowly started playing, and they started singing very loudly, very slowly, because I was humming the chords on the piano. And when we got finally to the chorus, the grand chorus of this hymn, I thought, too many notes for me. And so we faded out and sang a
cappella.
A cappella.
Yeah.
Yes. Afterwards, when everyone had left, the pastor says to me, I thought you would never stop playing Kumbaya.
Oh, my God.
And I said, I thought you would never stand up so I could finish playing. But we've laughed many laughs, and we always laugh about it when we think about quality opportunities here. Another one that I would just quickly say to you, oftentimes we will offer worship service that is renewal baptism. And we had planned this worship service and thought it was so meaningful to have the pastor stand and hold the bowls. And it was going to be even more meaningful that they would pick out a stone and take with them from the bowls. The bowls were purchased, the stones were put in, and they were beautiful. They were standing on columns on the altar table, and the pastors were going to pick up the bowls and go to their stations. Well, I knew that we were in trouble when two of the pastors were standing at the table shaking, literally, and had all the steps yet to go down.
Oh, no.
The bowls were so heavy that they were doing isometric exercises while holding the bowls. And it was a lovely service, so meaningful to the congregation, but the pastors will never let me forget.
Oh, yeah.
You will notice that they are never holding bowls. They are
Yes.
always on tables for them to stand behind.
I saw a similar experience at a church that I was working at where an acolyte was recessing with the altar Bible, which often are large Bibles,
Heavy Bibles.
and heavy. And she was probably about 7 years old and couldn't have been 4 feet tall. And she took her cue to lift the Bible one element in the service too early, and for the next 7 minutes proceeded to stand in front of the altar holding the Bible
Just shaking.
and just shaking. And she gutted it out and just did her
Oh,
very
man.
darndest and managed to recess out of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
But it just reminds me of that experience as well.
Well, it's just so interesting to me. Not interesting. It's a God moment, right? That even in the messy moments and the ones that don't go as planned, that God is just so present in them and gives us joy and memories through that, but that it doesn't seem to take away from the meaning and the impact that it has for the people who are in that space. I remember a couple of years ago preaching here in the sanctuary, and I had just finished a sermon about trust and trusting God. And during the last hymn, lightning struck and the organ went out. And so we
remember
had
that.
to sort of pretend through singing the last song. And I remember saying in my benediction, I guess I have to put my words into actions now. I have to trust God now, that even when things are not going to work the way that we expect, God is still very present. And I think that that's such a great image for our church.
And so often we dwell, at least as worship planners, we dwell on the things that didn't go well. And we think, oh, this service was a disaster and all of these things. And yet, in spite of that, people constantly are coming up affirming just what an impactful worship service it was and how insignificant maybe some of the things that we felt like didn't go well turned out to be. So, Gloria, even after some messy and hard moments, why is being part of the church still worth it?
I, this morning, spent the morning with my grandchildren at Grandparents' Day. And when they opened the floor to grandparents to ask them questions of the administrators that were there, the question that one grandfather stood and asked was, "What are you doing to protect my children from a live shooter in the school?" Our children are having to spend time learning how to be safe at school. And there are so many more examples of that in the world today. I've read recently a book, Less Than Zero. He talks about spiritual and moral poverty that underline our society today, that has been hidden, the spiritual and moral poverty that we suffer from. We're covering it up with possessions, with power, with striving to be successful. And we could talk about a jillion things in this vein as to why church has value and what its place is in the world and what our job is. It is hard and it is messy to do church. And there's no easy answer to all that church involves. But I come back and I think about if you're in an exercise program right now, what is it they try to build up? They build your core, and they'll talk about that all the time. And that's what I think our business is to build the core of our members, our congregation, of our communities, a core that is centered on faith, to build our lives on, to have families have a core that they can return to. That's what I returned to at that moment when I was told that I really wasn't welcome and that they didn't believe in what my husband was doing. That's what you return to in the hard times. That's what you celebrate in the joyous times, and why I think it's so relevant and why the church is alive and must be building the core of strong people and people who sincerely know that they are children of God. If every person in a community can say, "I am a child of God," what a difference that would make in our world today. What a difference that could make for everyone to know that they are loved, that they belong, that they have a center. And when you talk about a church, and you say church is not easy, you're not talking about the four walls of the church. You're talking about life. You're talking about the core of who you are. And it's not just the moments in worship on Sunday morning. It's who you are Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday. It's more than Sunday.
It's more than Sunday. That's who we want to be as an Access community. That's who we want to be as a church community. That's the reason we started this podcast, was to have an opportunity on more than just Sunday to connect with our faith, to hear stories about life and community and the way that Christ moves through all of those things.
As Gloria reminded us about strengthening our core and opening ourselves up not only to receiving grace, but to giving grace, even to our church, I was reminded of a scripture from 2 Corinthians 12 that I want to leave you with today. It says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or YouTube to not miss our next show. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Gloria Scott for joining us this week, and make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Connie Presley about things you should know about moms. Have a great week.